Hey, good day, everybody. Welcome back to the Noahide path. We're doing the Rabbinic Chain from Sinai, part 5 for today, and it covers the 1700s to the modern era. And we're just waiting on Rabbi Shulman to arrive in the Zoom meeting. He should be along any second. I know he likes to give it a few extra minutes to make sure people that want to click into the Zoom do attend. The Zoom room's been open for a bit. I'm joined by a few wonderful people. Got my friend Ronald down in Australia, friend Scotty down in Tennessee, and Veronica, who's now in Calgary. And we got Daniel Lopez as well. So, yeah, always good to be together. And we're just waiting on Rabbi Shulman, and we'll be live shortly. Oh, everybody's gone camera shy. Well, I don't have your microphone.
Because when you sent out the post for the group, it didn't have the Zoom on it. So I had to import it over from another computer. So well, truth of the matter is there is of course an advantage being in the Zoom session. First, you can see what I look like. That always is good enough. And second, it gives me an idea of people who are here. The more people are here, the better it comes out. So I don't see how many people. Not just better questions, it's just that a better interaction from my part. If there's an audience of only 5 or 6 people, that's one thing, but an audience of 50 people, then, I have to step up my game a little bit. So, move my hands a moment. Okay, let's wait for another 2 or 3 minutes. How are we doing in the other places, YouTube and Facebook? Okay, yeah, I know. Let's wait a couple minutes for them to start, populating over there. Unlike YouTube, we can sit together and we can, schmooze together, Scotty and Ron. So far the sessions have been pretty good. I will be able to finish what I wanted to do, which is 18th, 19th, and 20th century. the reason why we'll be able to finish up until that time is because the discussions on the two important movements in Europe, the Hasidic movement and the Yeshiva movement, I'm going to have a special thing for them. So we'll just be discussing rabbis that are in general important to know who they are. And then we will do those separately after we do some other stuff first. I think that's the best way of going. And of course, once it's on YouTube, it doesn't make a difference because people listening on YouTube could follow the playlist any way they want. We did have last night a very active discussion after we shut off the Zoom session, which was sort of nice. By the way, one of the reasons other people who are not listening on Zoom, one of the reasons for why it's an advantage to go to the Zoom session is that we actually have interaction with those people who've taken the time and exerted themselves to come to the Zoom session. But we will talk back and forth about issues that come up, not necessarily related to what I'm going to be talking about, but like afterwards or beforehand, we will sometimes just talk about general issues, things that have to do with Noahides, which are not directly related to what the topic is at hand. And it gives a chance for you to have personal interaction with somebody. Something that is very, very important as far as what the group Noahide Path is about, is to strongly encourage that. I have spoken with a number of rabbis who are involved, and they recognize the importance of this personal relationship with somebody who is qualified to answer your questions, both Noahide laws and also to discuss with you just basically in general the whole issues that a Noahide faces. So, again, those of you who are on other places, I encourage you to try and get on the Zoom session. And then if you want, you might just want to post the link for the Zoom session, just in case somebody who's there wants to try and come into the Zoom session in the middle. I didn't look and see how long it was, but I think it was the two sessions we had were somewhere around an hour, give or take a few minutes. 90 minutes? Oh, that was last night? Yeah. Yeah, it depends on here. Some people are very talkative and chatty. They want to discuss different things, so that's fine. That's part of what we're trying to do here, trying to give a certain type of. Okay. Okay, so every once in a while, I will mention for those people there that if they want, the Zoom session is open. They can come to Zoom session and actually have a more personal interaction than they're getting. Right? Yeah. I see. I understand that. I understand the Zoom is a little bit difficult on the telephone, but okay. I will start at 10 after. That gives enough time for people to just come in. This session now will be not only here, but we will also this will be the primary one that's going to be posted out on the internet. Although on my YouTube group, all of them will be available, but the primary one that we post is usually this one because it has more people, and we end up having more interesting questions that come towards the end or in the middle or stuff like that. Now, Ronald, I see you stayed up for us tonight.
No, I did get about 5 hours sleep.
Yeah, well, I also tried to lie down a little bit afterwards.
I didn't think you'd have time for that.
What?
I didn't think you would have time for having a rest.
Okay, let's begin. Now, this is going to be our last session dealing with the issue of the chain of Jewish tradition. We're talking now in a unit about Noahides and rabbis. And what we're doing now is the first Zoom discussion we had on this dealt with the issue of rabbinic authority, where it comes from. We go through the biblical text and discuss various issues around that. I encourage you all to look on YouTube in my YouTube group, Moshe Shulman, which has a picture of me on it. So if you're able to see what I look like, you can see what group is mine. There's another Moshe. There's actually two Moshe Shulman. One's a rabbi and one is a musician. But in any case, if you see my group, you will see that the other earlier Zoom sessions that we had. First one dealt with rabbinic authority, explaining where it comes from biblically and discussing various aspects with regards to biblical authority of the rabbis. And from there, we're going into a discussion. We went into a discussion, I think this is the fifth session actually, tracing the chain of Jewish rabbinic authority tradition from the time when Moshe was given the Torah on Mount Sinai, through Joshua, through all the judges, through down to the times of the first century, the Second Temple period, with the rabbis from generation to generation, how it went from different areas, how things developed. And now we're coming to the end of the story. We ended with the 17th century last week. So this week we're going to the 18th century and the 19th century and the 20th century. These 3 centuries are important for a number of reasons, although everything until now is important. And as we, in the next session, we discuss about Jewish learning, how rabbis actually, the subjects rabbis learn, how they learn, how we get about to the point where somebody's a rabbi who's qualified to answer the questions of Noahide and do things of that nature. We'll find that many of the rabbis that I've mentioned before will come up every once in a while, some directly, some indirectly. But from the 18th century and on, we're going to be seeing things that are more impacting on the people that you're going to be interacting with. So we'll see developments specifically in the 18th century and continuations into the 19th century, which will sort of give you a little perspective of a number of issues, including, who are the rabbis that involved, where do they come from, why the reasons involvement is. The whole purpose of this being is that as Noahide is coming out of Christianity, which is what most of you are doing, there are a few exceptions, but in general, that's what it is. You're entering a world that is totally different. And one of the things that makes it different is the concept of rabbinic authority and who to go to. And unfortunately, not having, you were raised, of course, where Hashem wanted you to be. But because of that, you don't know about the Jewish community, what really is going on there. You can't tell, for example, on YouTube between a rabbi who doesn't know anything that he's talking about and a rabbi who does. You only know what they say, whether seem to like it, but whether you like it, what you like doesn't necessarily mean that this rabbi is somebody who knows what he's talking about. So what we're trying to do in this particular unit is to give you some pointers and ideas on how to recognize somebody who's talking who actually knows the material well enough that you can rely on what he's saying, or who's not. And this is something that the Jewish people know about growing up in communities. They already know who to go to, who's the rabbi, who's authority, who's not. And that's something that Noahide is coming from a certain background. The Jewish community, what really a rabbi and a pastor are totally different things. A rabbi has to have a certain degree of knowledge and has to be recognized for having that knowledge. It's more of a meritocracy, where pastor is basically, you put your shingle out and you attract people. And if they like you, you get big. And if they don't like you, then you don't get big. And if you get big, you get a lot of money, you become rich, and you buy a house and an airplane and all other kinds of things like that. No names will be mentioned. Although I do know of one pastor whose last name is Dollar, and I thought that was very appropriate. Okay, so let us begin. So we're going to talk about the 18th century first. Now, the boundaries are not exact. Some people span one century to another. I just include them in the century that I feel is more appropriate, but it's not necessarily there. And as I've done until before now, what I want to start with is discussing the 18th century and discuss it from first a historical point of view. A historical point of view gives you a certain background to understand what's going on. As we've seen in the past, for example, when the Seljuk Turks invaded and took over the area in the Middle East and subjugated it, that was a catalyst for the closing of the yeshivas that had existed in Babylonia for hundreds of years, and a certain degree of stability that existed among the Jewish people and among the rabbis, which allowed for a certain type of system to develop. After that time, the system changed and split between those Jews who were in Christian countries, which is Europe, those Jews who were in Muslim countries, which was Spain and Africa. And these areas developed some interaction, but mostly separately, so that they developed certain ways of answering certain questions and made what we see the differences today. But underlying that was a change, sociological change in the system. Same thing happened at the end of the 15th century, where the Jews were expelled from Spain. And at the same time, they were expelled from most of the cities from the Holy Roman Empire, Germany, we know as Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, and moved to the east. This total change led to a change in the quality and the center of gravity for where Jewish law was done. And both of these represent, in Jewish thinking, changes in periods of time. When the yeshivas closed in Babylonia, that was the end of the period of the Gaonim, and it started the era of the Rishonim, the beginning of the rabbis. That when with expulsion from Spain and the Jews moving towards the east, ended the era of the Rishonim and started the era of the Gaonim. It's very important to understand that many times the social things that are going on have had significant effects on the Jewish people, in many cases forcing them from the larger areas to smaller areas, and concentrating and limiting the limit of rabbinic interaction. This is just a point. So that's the reason why I'm doing the historical stuff beforehand, to give you an idea of what's going on. It also gives an interesting background for people who might not know what's going on. So in the 18th century, we can still talk about the differences between what's happening in what we call Ashkenaz. Ashkenaz is the Hebrew name for Germany. But by this time, the Jews are already in Eastern Europe. So it's not really Germany, although there's communities in Germany. The German community is very small in comparison to the majority of Jews who are now living at this time in the area of Poland. Okay? Then, same thing as Sparta, the Sparta are no longer in Spain. They are now in primarily countries under the Ottoman Empire. So let's start with some of the historical stuff in Germany and Ashkenaz. The most significant event that occurs during this period of time, from the years 1772 to 1795, is the partition of the Kingdom of Poland-Lithuania by Russia, Prussia is what later became Germany, and Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The split meant that Jews who had one time lived in one area together were now divided up among different countries. This also led to the end of what was called, we mentioned the Council of the Four Lands. In the last session, we talked about that, which was basically a Sanhedrin-like organization where all the difficult cases that came about, business law and stuff like that, sometimes marriage law cases of divorces, for example, actually ended up going to the Vaad to adjudicate them. So there was this somewhat of a central authority. This collapsed also under at the same time as the partition ended. And this ended up causing a little bit of a change in the nature of rabbinic authority being more restricted in certain lands. And we really did talk about Judaism as being different in different parts of this area than they were. It's very hard to talk about a united Ashkenaz Judaism. It's Judaism in different areas. So that happened. And then in 1791, there was a creation of the Pale settlement. What happened is that Russia took over the eastern part of Poland, which had a huge amount of Jews in it. And the Russians were very anti-Semitic. And because of that, they did not like the idea that now that these people were part of Russia, they did not like the idea of them mixing together with the Christian population. So what was decreed in 1791 is they created what's called the Pale settlement. That was the areas in which Jews were allowed to live, and they could not move out of it. So, for example, they could not live without permission, for example, in some of the big cities. I believe St. Petersburg was one of them, which was the capital. They could not live there. They had to go there to visit. There was a different story, but they could not live in many, many areas. Moscow, I think, was also outside of the Pale. Pale settlement was a place where they had to live. Okay? That was what was going on in Europe. In Sephardic lands, remember, they were under the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire actually brought stability in that area, which had not seen stability for many, many hundreds of years. In fact, the kind of stability they hadn't really been seen from the 4th, 5th century, which saw the closing of the Jerusalem Talmud and saw the beginning of many, many Jews being exiled and fleeing from the land because of persecution from the Byzantine Christians. And throughout that time, although there were Jews living in the land, the level of Judaism in that land, the level of rabbinics in that land, was not on the high level that we have in other places. So there were no real rabbis that we could mention there, except, for example, Maimonides went to live in the land, the Ramban, Nachmanides went to live there. But there were not people who were like indigenous part of the land on that level. The centers of rabbinic learning and knowledge was not in that land and did not return until the Ottoman Empire brought a certain degree of stability. And then Jews started coming from Spain there. The Ottoman Empire allowed people from Spain to go there. So they came and started living in the land, and the level of Jewish learning under the Ottoman Empire increased. Now, that didn't mean that everything was so good, but so we'll deal with a few things that were going on. In the year 1740, we find that the city of Tiberias is rebuilt. Tiberias in the Galilee is one of two important cities in that area. The second one is Sfat, and Tiberias is a second. They are important because they're places where a large number of Jews, comparatively for that time, cities didn't have a little more than 15, 20,000 people. So a large number of Jews were living there in the populace at that time, and Tiberias was one of them. It was one of the places where the Hasidim went to, Tiberias and Sfad. There's some famous cemeteries in both places where you will see many important people who went to Israel from Europe because of the stability that the Ottoman Empire brought about. Now, the first Aliyah to Israel, mass Aliyah to Israel, was in 1740 to 750. Now, there were Jews always coming to Israel. As I mentioned, Maimonides went there, and there were always just from people from Tosfos in the Middle Ages. Some of them came to Israel. So it's not that there weren't people coming. It was just because of the situation there. The Crusades were going on. There was persecutions. There was continual invasions. The Mongols invaded the Middle East. There was a lot of, instability there. And the instability made it more difficult for people to come there or even to live there. So there wasn't as much. In 1740, 1750, because of stability, a lot more Jews came from Europe. And this is the first Aliyah to Israel. And this was an Aliyah from the Hasidic movement. We're going to talk about when the Hasidic movement comes about, but this is the first Hasidic movement. And as I mentioned, there's a cemetery in Tiberias, in Tiberia, we call it. If you go there, there's a very famous cemetery, which has a section from the Hasidim who came originally. And you'll see buried the Hasidim who came in the first Aliyah, the first group of people who moved from outside the land to the land of Israel. in 1747. These were the first generation of many of them who were students, followers of the founder of the Hasidic movement. Now, as I mentioned, things weren't always so good there. So, for example, we know of some pogroms that the Muslims did with the Jewish people living in 775 in the city of Hebron. Hebron is a city that until the year 1929 had a continual Jewish presence there from the times of the Second Temple on. The other time in 1799, the city of Sfad, the city of Sfad, I mentioned that. That was one of the cities where Hasidim went to. That had a pogrom in 1799. So that gives you a certain background of what's going on. Again, in the area of the Middle East, there was somewhat of a stability brought about by the Ottoman Empire. And in Europe, more or less, it was pretty stable, except with Poland being divided, the Jews, many Jews became under the Russian anti-Semitic empire. I mean, not that the others were much better, but still, it started getting pretty bad. And we'll see some more things when we get to the 19th century, how bad it got. So now we can talk about in the land of Ashkenaz, different areas, because they developed amongst themselves a different, I would call it culture, because there's no really other word that we can use for it. Okay, so we'll deal with the area of Czechoslovakia. That's now the Czech Republic, Slovakia. At that time, it would be called Bohemia, Moravia, Slovakia. This area there, which is so Prague was the main city there. These areas had their own, identifiable group. Okay, so the first one I want to mention is Yonason Eibeshitz. He's a very, very famous rabbi. He was a number of works on Jewish law that are very significant. He has a commentary on the Jewish laws dealing with kosher laws, which is what everybody learns who wants to get smicha in America today. He also wrote, he was well known as a Kabbalist, and he also wrote commentaries on the biblical texts, a number of texts. He has a number of books, Teresh Yonason's on the biblical text, with, homiletic interpretations of that. He also has a book of sermons, called Yaris Dvash, which is very, very popular. Sermons he would give every week. Second person from this period of time I want to mention is Yecheskel Landau. He's known for the Noda B'Yehuda. That's a responsive work. He was a rabbi of the city of Prague. His influence then and later on was immense. He was revered and respected from everybody around. He's one of those rabbis that basically, he was a rabbi that was somewhat universal. What he had said, everybody had to interact with him. We'll talk more about this kind of concept later, but he was a significant rabbinic figure of the time. Following that, we have Shmuel Low. He wrote a work called Machzos HaShekel. He lived in Moravia. The head city of Moravia was Nikolsburg. The rabbi of Nikolsburg was basically the rabbi of all of Moravia. And a number of very important rabbis were rabbi there. We're not going to be mentioning some of them, but there were some very important rabbis who were there. He wrote a work important called Machzos HaShekel. Now, last time we discussed about the Shulchan Aruch by Yosef Karo, how for the Jews who were living in Europe, it had some things which weren't good because they had developed customs as far as in decisions with Jewish law that didn't always agree with him. So Moshe Israelis, we called it Amu, added comments to that. Now, after that came out, there were other rabbis in the next generations who added comments on the Shulchan Aruch, the whole Shulchan Aruch together. One of them was the Mogen Avrum, and the other was the Torizal. These are the two main ones. Now, the Machzos HaShekel was a commentary on these commentaries. So the Machzos HaShekel is made of two commentaries. One's a commentary on the Mogen Avrum, and the other one is a commentary on the Torizal. This is a work that people who learn for the halacha, want to learn what the law is, Jewish law is, they learn that in addition to the other commentaries, have a fuller understanding of what's going on, so that they're able to decide what is the Jewish law, or even just to understand where it's coming from. The final person I want to mention lived in Slovakia. His name was Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Rabbi Akiva Eiger is very, very important. He was influential in Jews in Hungary later on. We'll mention Moshe Sofer, he'll come up. And he lived as Svaki, he wrote things on the Talmud, and he wrote also things on Jewish law. So that was Czechoslovakia. Next, we'll move to Poland. Now, Poland did exist as a sort of an area. Jews referred to Poland, even after the Poland was divided, they still considered it Poland as a land, an entity, even though Poland as a state did not exist. So I believe later on this was called Congress Poland by the Russians. So this area was called Poland itself, but it really didn't have any independence. It was really part of Russia. It's not until the First World War and the First World War that Poland becomes a state again. So here we have a number of very important figures as far as Jewish law is concerned and other things. The first one I want to talk about is a commentary on the whole of Shulchan Aruch called the Bar Haita. And the Bar Haita was written by two people. One of them was Zechariah Mendel from the city of Krakow. He wrote the Bar Haita on the section called Yeridaya, which includes with kosher laws and a number of other types of important ritual laws, and Choshen Mishpat, which is the laws that deal with business. He wrote the Bar Haita on that. And what basically the Bar Haita does is he takes the commentaries that have existed on Shulchan Aruch, the Shulchan Aruch and the commentaries, and he brings together the final halachic decision on that. Excuse me. So this is what the Bar Haita did, the one on these two parts of it. And there's another one on the other two parts we'll get to shortly. Then there is Yaakov Yeshua Falk. He wrote commentaries on the Talmud and Halacha. His Talmud commentary is called the Tzlach, a very deep and intricate and difficult commentary. And Pnei Yeshua is his response. Pnei Yeshua is an important character in halachic tradition, in general halachic tradition. Again, not even these people who are important in halachic tradition are not necessarily writing things about Noahides. They're writing things about Judaism itself. So Noahides don't really come into it, but it's important to understand, as far as Jewish tradition, these are the people that, people that are learning. Rabbis are learning in order to have their knowledge and understanding and actually gain the ability to decide things in the book. The next one I mentioned is from 1698 to 1760, is Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov. He is considered he's the founder of the Hasidic movement. Now, I will be doing Yetz Hashem after we go a little bit farther in the next couple of units, maybe in a few months from now. I'm going to do Zoom sessions on the history of the Hasidic movement from the Baal Shem Tov until today, so that when you go around, you hear about different Hasidic groups today, you will find out how they go back to the Baal Shem Tov, where they veer off one to another, and basically a little bit about the differences of things. So you can see what's in the Jewish world today. People that you can interact with. Most of the people you can interact will be in Chabad. They're the ones who are most active and as far as Noahide things, but not that the only thing out there. There's a lot of people in different places. Gives you an idea of what the actual Jewish world looks like today. So he died in 1760. He's the first generation. As I mentioned, there was the Aliyah to Israel. Among his students from 1720 to 1740 was the first generation of people who came up to Israel. We have some historical information about him, but I think when we go to discuss about the Hasidic movement, we'll discuss about that. The other movement we're going to talk about is what we call the Yeshiva movement. These are those people who come from the students, the school of the Vilna Gaon, who we're going to mention shortly, and leading until today with the yeshivas, various yeshivas of renown. The Musar movement comes out of that. We'll be discussing that also then. So you get an idea of Orthodox Judaism, where these things all come from. Okay, the next person is Yosef Thurman. He lived in the city of Lemberg, which today is known as the city of Lvov. And he wrote a work called Prima Gudim. Prima Gudim is a commentary on Shulchan Aruch. It's a significant commentary when somebody is learning Halacha, wants to know what things are. The Prima Gudim is one of the sources he goes to look for. Next, we have two rabbis who wrote commentaries on the business laws, which takes up a lot of commentaries were written on business law. So it's an important thing. Remember, it didn't. This time it had ended before when there was the Council of Four Lands. They used to use this council as somewhat of a Sanhedrin to go to adjudicate business laws. So many of these discussions that come here come about based on precedents, based on discussions of business law that came about. In sociologically, the Jewish communities were basically independent, so that they were able to deal with business issues within their own communities. This started to end under the Enlightenment and stuff like that, but essentially they were independent. So the first rabbi we're talking about here is Aryeh McClain Heller. He wrote a work called Kitzos HaChoshen, and this is a commentary on what's Choshen Mishpat, which is a business law. The other rabbi is Rabbi Yaakov Lorberbaum. He wrote Nesivos HaMishpat. Again, this is a commentary, halakha commentary on basically Choshen Mishpat, the laws of business. Okay. Next, we'll move to Lithuania and Russia. Now, before the splitting up, the Ubteiling, they called it, before the dividing up of Poland, Lithuania and Poland was one commonwealth, one kingdom together. Afterwards, they became totally separate and, in fact, developed in different ways. So at this time, we can start talking about Poland and Lithuania as being different. So in Lithuania, we come first to the Vilna Gaon. Vilna Gaon, Lithuania, Russia, the Vilna Gaon is the most significant figure as far as Lithuanian Judaism. And in the 18th century, he's one of three people who impacted Judaism to such an extent that we could say that from the 18th century, it was a significant trajectory change in Jewish life. So the Vilna Gaon lived from 1720 to 1797. He was not technically a rabbi of anything. He just learned all day long. But because of his erudition and knowledge, he was considered authority by people, and people went to him. He had commentaries on Talmud. He had commentaries on Jewish law. He was actually wrote commentaries in Kabbalah. He was rounded, very well rounded. And from him came out of school, which really basically is what we call the yeshiva movement today. Now, I should mention at this time was the beginning of what they call the Enlightenment. It started in Germany, and I will get to Germany shortly, but the Enlightenment started in Germany, and this was a movement that, whatever it was supposedly supposed to be, ended up being a movement that was basically assimilationist. So the founder of the movement, who was a religious Jew, Moshe Mendelssohn, every one of his children converted to Christianity. Because the movement itself went away from the Torah path that had been the tradition till then, and it's something that we know and have seen continually happening in history, that Jews who veer away from this chain of tradition eventually disappear. So, for example, when we're taking this time now, we can't really talk about the Karaites very much, because as a movement, they were virtually non-existent. And even today, although you hear that there are Karaite Jews in Israel, their numbers are maybe less than 50,000 in comparison to Orthodox Jews, even after the slaughter of World War II and all the other things. The Jews who follow our traditions are many, many times greater than them. So the Vilna Gaon is the father of what we would call the yeshiva. We'll talk about that again. The next rabbi of significance in that time is actually a Hasidic rabbi, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. He is actually the founder of the Chabad movement, of which Lubavitch is the only example of it still left in the world. There were other groups. We'll talk about when we talk about Hasidic history, because there were other Chabad groups besides Lubavitch. It's just Lubavitch is the only one that lasted till today. He's important because, not because of his Hasidic writings, which of course is important to the Hasidic world, but because of his legal writings. He wrote a Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch basically follows very much the Mogen Avim, but it was one of the first works which took from the big Shulchan Aruch wrote it down in a shorter form so that a layperson could just pick it up and look at it and see what to do. Okay. In addition, in that time also was another rabbi. He was from the school of Vilna Gaon. His name was Rabbi Danzig, and he wrote a work Chai Uda, which was in some ways similar to Shulchan Aruch, the Rav Shulchan Aruch, but it was just written in a different order. So he has something on Orach Chaim. He has another one called Chai Uda on Yeridea, the laws of kashrus. He has something. Now he was Lithuanian. He followed that it was in the school of the Vilna Gaon. And his is slightly different, but it's important because we're seeing now a move towards writing abbreviated versions of the Shulchan Aruch, bring them into summaries of them. Okay, so that's basically Lithuanian Russian Judaism, because they were pretty similar. Next, we want to go to Germany. Germany was still a community then, but it was beginning to be affected by the Enlightenment, and we'll see in the next century where the Reform takes over and basically decimates Orthodoxy in Germany. So in Germany at this time, we have the first rabbi. He's referred to as Chacham Tzvi. It was Tzvi Hirsch Ashkenazi, who lived in the city of Amsterdam. Now, Amsterdam was the Netherlands, but it's considered part of Germany when we talk about that area, because the customs and the language was so similar. They're considered as being really part of one area by itself. So now he was called Chacham Tzvi for very interesting, even though he was an Ashkenazi, even though he was a German Jew, meaning he was European, he was called Chacham Tzvi because he was the rabbi of the Sephardic community. Now, rabbis in Europe under Ashkenazim were called rabbi. That was the title. But by the Sephardim, they did not call them rabbis. They called them Chacham. Chacham, like we call the Chachamim, the rabbis in the Talmud called the Chachamim, the wise ones. Okay, so that name was kept actually by Sephardim, but in Europe, the name rabbi took place. And it goes back to rabbi is actually what Rabbi was called in Rav. Someone was called the Rav was from Babylonia. Rabbi was someone who came from Israel, and so that's the name that was in Europe. Whereas in Sephardic lands they used the name Chacham. So he was called Chacham Tzvi, very significant rabbi in halacha as far as that's concerned. One of the very, very big people in that area. His son's name was Yankov Emden. He had no rabbinic post, but he did write things in halacha and hashkafa, and there's a very famous commentary on the Siddur that he has. And he lived again in Germany, lived in an area there. He's known, among other things, because he had a going fight with Yonason Eibishitz, who we mentioned, who lived in Czechoslovakia. The source of that is, I believe, in the last time we mentioned about Shabsi Tzvi, the false messiah, who converted to Islam. And he had followers in Europe. And when he converted to Islam, they started to keep the Sabbatean beliefs quiet, and they would openly act as if they belonged to the religion, to the area, but quietly they didn't. So this was a problem that happened in Europe. There were Jews who were followers of Shabsi Tzvi who would openly act as if they were religious Jews. In fact, in private, they would be violating the law all the time. So Yankov Emden accused Yonason Eibishitz of being a follower of Shabsi Tzvi because he wrote kamayas. Kamayas are like amulets for various things. And this argument went on for a while. Today, the truth of the matter is, as both of them are revered, and we just know the arguments, the fight between the two of them, and both of them are considered, great leaders of the Jewish people. And you'll find people in the same house will have both the Siddur from with Yankov Emden's commentary and the works of Yonason Eibishitz in the same time. Okay. Now, the last one I want to mention is Yehuda Ashkenazi. He was from Germany. Now, I mentioned the Bar Haitiv on two parts of the Shulchan Aruch. Yehuda Ashkenazi wrote the commentary Bar Haitiv on the other parts of the Shulchan Aruch. So he wrote on Orach Chaim, which are the day-to-day laws of the Jewish people, and he wrote on Even Esser, which are dealing with marriage laws. So, for example, there are people who, like myself when I was here, I learn the Shulman Aruch, and I look at the Bar Haitiv, because he brings down the final conclusions of halachas based on the Mogen of Woman and then the Taz, Terzah. Okay, that's that. And the last area we're going to cover is in Italy. Italy is sort of interesting in that, in a sense, we a lot of times we consider it as part of Ashkenaz, as part of Europe, and sometimes it's considered part of Sfard. A lot of Sephardim who left Spain, a lot of Jews who left Spain did come to Italy. But in general, he is considered Ashkenaz. So Moshe Chaim Luzzatto wrote a number of works in Kabbalah, very significant works in Kabbalah. His Kabbalah works are not as so influential in Europe among the Hasidim, although he is quite popular among a number of people who come from the school of the yeshiva world, the school of the Vilna Gaon. Among the Hasidim, his Kabbalah works are not very much learned. My Rebbe, who taught me these issues, he actually did have one of his form that he learned, but essentially he stayed within what's the usual thing, that is the usual form from the Ari and his Talmidim. The work that he did write, which has been universally accepted by the Hasidim, by the yeshiva world, is his work Mesilas Yesharim, which is a work essentially which is based on Chaim Vital's work Shara Kadisha. And what it is he expands on, in Shara Kadisha, Chaim Vital talks about how a Jew can reach the level of holiness by doing the mitzvahs and certain practices that one can have. And Mesilas Yesharim is like not just expansion, but a systematizing it in order from one level to another. Okay, it's not such a difficult work to read, but it's a very difficult work to live by. I know when I learned it, once you get a few chapters in there, like 5, 6, 7, once you get there, you realize you're not on the level of who he's talking to. You haven't reached that level. He's talking to people whose personal piety and personal actions are on much higher level. So that's the end of 18th century in Europe. When we go to the Sephardic world, and I must apologize in the Sephardic world, I am not familiar with all the people who probably should be here, but the ones that I do know are people who are known throughout by everybody, and certainly everybody will acknowledge that these people are important for the future. The first one I want to talk about is Yaakov Kuli. He died in 1732. His main work was a work called Ma'am Layatz. And what it was is he went through, it was actually written in Ladino. It was not written, he was written in Ladino, which is the language of Jews from Spain. Even after they went to Constantinople, there were still Jews who spoke that, just like there's Jews still today who speak Yiddish. There were Jews who were on the Ottoman Empire in Constantinople who spoke still Ladino, which is like a mixture of Spanish and Hebrew, just like Yiddish is a mixture of German and Hebrew. And so he wrote it in that language. It has been translated into English. Aryeh Kaplan did at least the Torah. I don't know how much more of it, but I don't know how much they've actually translated. I know the Torah completely has been translated. This is a very interesting work. It was written for the common people. So in general, it's written very, a lot of very interesting things in the Parsha. There are times when he goes into Jewish law and certain things like that. But in general, I would say that 80% of it is something that somebody who's a Noahide would find a lot of interesting stuff in there about what the Torah is about, what the rabbis have told us and taught us about it. So it's something that is definitely within the range of a type of commentary on the Torah that a Noahide can read. I would just suggest, just skipping the things about Jewish law. Most of what is Sephardic anyways. Very, very little stuff that touches on Kabbalah and things like that, because it was written essentially for the common people. So if you want, I think it's quite expensive actually, but again, that's what was a work that's there. And again, if you want to look at it in English, that certainly is okay. The next rabbi I want to talk about is Chaim ben Attar. He wrote a work called Orach Chaim, which is a commentary on the Torah. He was also a Kabbalist. In his commentary on the Torah, a number of times he deals with Kabbalistic issues. That's why I feel it's not appropriate for Noahides to learn it, because it deals with Kabbalistic issues, which you just will not be familiar with what he's basing it on. And it could bring you to have misunderstandings. One of the dangers of learning Kabbalah is, as we have seen many times with those few Noahides who actually look at such things, that you don't have the training to learn it, and so you come with ideas which are basically against the Torah. So it's better to stay away from. And the truth of the matter is, there's a lot of Jews who don't learn Kabbalah either. So it's not like just not Noahides, other people, because it's a learning that requires someone to have a rabbi to teach him what it is. Now he's interested, very interesting story about. He lived in Morocco originally, and he eventually moved to Jerusalem, where he's buried outside Jerusalem, his cemetery. You can actually go to his gravesite if you want. There's a road by the side of the walls of the old city, and he's buried there, but it's sort of a valley. There's a whole way to go down there. An interesting story about him, which is very, very interesting. He earned his living as a diamond cutter in Morocco. And what he would do is he would cut diamonds, and when he'd made enough money for that week from his diamond cutting, he would stop and go back and learn in the Beis Medrash. He'd learn Torah the rest of the time. He only worked for what he needed for that week, and then he would go and into the Beis Medrash. This is Muhammad. I actually, when I was in yeshiva, I forgot about this. I actually there was somebody in the yeshiva where I learned, whose name was Ben Attar. He was a descendant directly from the Orach Chaim. But his work is very significant. Even among Hasidim, although he's Sephardic, even among Hasidim, his work Orach Chaim is learned. I actually have a set here of Orach Chaim. There's a number of commentaries on it, and it's something that many Hasidim learn every week. The next person is the third significant figure of the 18th century Judaism. And he was among the Sephardim. He was Shalom Sharabi. His descendants is Rabbi Sharabi in Israel now, who's also a descendant of his. And he was a primary Kabbalist, as are his descendants. Now, his works in Kabbalah are based on Isaac Luria, but he expands on it, and has an elegant system which is somewhat different. I'm personally not very knowledgeable about it. I never had a teacher to teach me it. Although I've looked at some of the things on it, I do not, understand a lot of it. Though I understand some of what he's trying to do, but I don't understand the concepts behind it, all of them. But the Rishash's Kabbalah is very, very popular, significantly among the Sephardim. All of the latest Sephardim Kabbalists were actually coming from his school. And even nowadays in Europe, among the Hasidim, there are many people who pray from, what's called the Rishash Siddur, a special Siddur which has Kabbalistic kavanot, Kabbalistic, intentions in them. So we have three people in the 18th century that I mentioned. There were three people whose influence was significant on the Jewish people then. There was the Baal Shem Tov, who was the founder of the Hasidic movement. Now, when I talk about the Hasidic movement, we'll go into a little bit more, but the Hasidic movement is not really as new as some people try and make it out to be. When we talk about the Hasidic movement, we'll talk a little bit about that, but there was that. Then there was the movement of the Vilna Gaon, which ended up being what we would call the Yeshiva movement. These are the two main movements of Orthodoxy in Europe. And then we have among Sephardim, the Kabbalistic movement that goes back to Rishash. And the later people, the later generations in the Sephardic world, which is much more involved and viewed with Kabbalistic ideas than it was in Europe, they are followers of the Rishash. We call them Rishash and Shulman. Okay. The next person I want to talk about, and the last one of the Sephardim from this generation, is another significant. He was a Talmud of the Rishash. He followed that Rishash system. Chaim Yosef David Azulai, his father wrote an important work. His father was Avram Azulai, wrote Chesed Avram, a very significant work in Kabbalah. And he wrote a number of works in Kabbalah, in Jewish law. He has some Bible commentaries on the Torah and on the Megillahs that we read during the holidays. He lived in Jerusalem. He was in Italy sometimes. He's known by his acronym, the Chidu, and his works are also influential in Europe, specifically his work of Bayis HaKodesh, which talks about Kabbalistic customs, was known in Europe. And he came out of the Rishash's school. Okay, that ends the 18th century. The 19th century starts the period of what we call the later Achronim. And I'll just take a break right now. And if there's any questions, anybody has any questions anywhere dealing with these issues, we can entertain questions right now.
Oh, I have questions.
Yes.
Okay, so let me see if I can get this straight. You've got the Ashkenaz and the Sephardic, and there's looks like there's Mizrahim and Ethiopian. And those are all, I guess, would be considered ethnicities.
Okay, Mizrahim is Mizrah, really refers to the Jews who came from countries like Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Jewish communities that go back, the Iranian Jewish community goes back until basically right after the First Temple time. The grave sites of Mordechai and Esther, from that Mordechai and Esther from the book of Esther, is in Iran. The gravesite from Ezekiel, Yecheskel, is also there, if I remember correctly. And you can actually visit. I've actually seen pictures that people took who had visited it. So we're talking about communities of Jews that existed for 2,000 years until 1948, which we'll get up to.
Okay, I'm sorry.
But the quality, what happened is under the Muslim invasions, under that, I mean, essentially, the quality of life, the quality of the rabbis there just went down. So when the Seljuk Turks invaded that area, it brought to the end to the period of the Gaonim and the two yeshivas that existed in that area that had existed for hundreds of years. And that brought an immediate drop in the quality of the rabbis who were in that area. Because in order to become a rabbi of a certain stature, you have to be among other people that you can interact and back and forth. If there's no back and forth, among opinions where you can discuss and argue out, see what you really don't get to the level that you're able to understand this. That's why you'll see when rabbis get together and they discuss, they always argue with each other. Not argue with each other just because they dislike each other. It has nothing to do with that. I mean, I've met with Rabbi Weiner and Rabbi Blumenstiel. I've talked with Rabbi Weiner. I've disagreed with some things. It's not because I don't like him. Actually, I like him very personally. He's a very humble and knowledgeable person. I just disagree with what he said. So we'll argue back and forth. The source is what they say as to whose view is correct. Okay, but the ability to have a deep knowledge in Torah requires you to be among other people. This week we learned in Perkei Uvos. It says one rabbi was asked he should come to a certain city and live among them, and he said that he did not want to go there. He only wanted to be in a city where there were Torah scholars. What's the reason for it? Because the Torah is important. The only way you can become a rabbi, to be somebody who's actually knowledgeable, is if you can interact with people who are also knowledgeable on the subject and get to the bottom of these kinds of things. Okay, that's what makes Torah learning much different. When we talk about rabbis and when we talk about Noahide and Torah, we're going to talk about this next time. The next time we're going to be talking about rabbis, what they learn. We'll talk about this some also. What is important as far as Torah learning and as far as the quality of the person is the fact that the rabbi you want has to have had interacted not just with rabbi, but with the different works on the subject. If this rabbi has not interacted with some of the works that I'm going to be mentioning even today, then he hasn't gotten enough learning to be able to fully answer questions. He might be giving you, 70% of the time good answers, but 30% of the time he won't be because he hasn't interacted. He doesn't have a level of knowledge. So let's take Rabbi Weiner, for example. He's learned, this stuff. You can see from even his notes that he's learned a lot of the works that I'm going to be talking to you about, and in discussions, and we can see that both of us have learned these things. So you can discuss with each other, and even if you come to disagreements about how, in a practical way, it's still, you're dealing with people who have learned it. So the differences become less important. When you're dealing with people who haven't learned it and are saying views, based but not knowing it, then that's where a lot of the problems come about. Again, I'm not going to mention names. There's names I could mention, but that's where these problems come about. So Mizrahi Jews are the Jews from that area. Ethiopian Jews, there is a lot of controversy about. Okay, where the Ethiopian Jews come from, the discussion about that is more political as far as I'm concerned than religious. Okay, and
So for a Noahide, does it really matter? Does it really matter whether a rabbi is any of these Ashkenazi or Sephardic or whatever? Does it really matter for a Noahide to say, okay, I'd rather follow somebody who's Sephardic or whatever?
The answer is, yeah, I would say the answer is probably no. Again, the same questions apply with the thing. I know, for example, one person who, I'm not going to mention his name because I do not allow his stuff to be cross-posted into my group because I don't like his approach. Not specifically what he says. He said what he says about Noahides, even though he's Sephardic. I don't like the way he approaches the subject, and I've been many times asked private by Noahides based on some things he's given out lectures and other things. I don't like his approach. Okay, so I don't usually cross-post his stuff. But as far as Noahide laws are concerned, he's very knowledgeable and he's correct in what he says. And he's Sephardic. That's very rare. There's very few people out there who are Sephardic who are involved with Noahide. But again, he's one. Most of the people you will be involved with are from Ashkenaz. And
Okay.
I will say that most of them are not overly knowledgeable. Okay?
Right. Okay.
That's just where their knowledge is very superficial. So, they can give you basic outlines and guidelines, but if it comes to, really issues like, if you see something in divine code and you have a question, whatever, he seems to be disagreeing with them, this person, will not be able to give you a clear answer. Like, or for example, in divine code says some things, I can give you more of a clear answer. Divine code is pretty much, I'm in agreement with him on most things. There's certain areas which I disagree with him. A lot of things that he gives as suggestions. I'm very much against giving suggestions of what to do because Noahides usually take that as not a suggestion, meaning that you don't have to do it. If you like it, you can do it. If you don't, you don't. But they take suggestions. Oh, a rabbi said I should that it's a suggestion. That means it's something I should be doing.
Right.
Okay. And
Yeah.
again, the Noahide movement has not progressed, as far as I can see, to the type of maturity that a rabbi can say, listen, this is a good idea to do this. You don't have to do that, where you'll have an audience of 10 people and only 1 or 2 people say, yeah, that's for me. If you say that in a group of 10 people, 9 or 10 out of 10 will do it. Okay, so a perfect example is there are a number of Siddurim that are out there. Every single Siddur says in the beginning, these are only suggestions. You don't have to do this. Okay, the suggestions based on pressure coming from the outside that people want to have more of formalized words to do it. Again, that comes because these Noahides are coming to Torah observant Christianity, and they have they're used to a formalized type of religion as opposed to a free-form type of religion, which in Noahide, when I get to Noahide and religion, we'll talk more about that, and especially about prayer and how it really should be done. So they ask for siddur, and you'll see in every single siddur, if you look at it, there's it's like a contract. You have a big contract, and in small letters it says, you should know this. So in small letters, and every single says, these are just suggestions. You don't have to do this. And the problem that I have with that is that, yes, that's probably true. But, Noahide's looking at that, don't understand when you say suggestion means is you don't have to do it. There's absolutely no obligation whatsoever. 100%. If you ignore everything it says here, you're not going to displease God. They usually think is, if it's a suggestion, that means there must be some real advantage for me doing it. But there's no advantage for you doing it. Okay, so that's my critique of basically the divine code. There's a lot of stuff in there that I say, yeah, they're very nice things to do. I mean, you can do it, whatever. But I know a Noahide reading it will say, it says it there, then that means I've got to do it. Okay. And that is basically the first step towards making a new religion. So I'm very, very nervous about it. And this kind of discussion, by the way, will come up more and more in different Zoom sessions. When we talk about religion, we talk about things, people can ask me questions about doing certain things. And I'll explain again and again what I mean. It's very important to understand that there's no obligation to do many of these things what Noahides think they're obligated to do. There is zero obligation. And if you don't do it ever your whole life, you still, if you're following the 7 mitzvahs like you're required to do, and you're doing because Hashem said to do it, and you're following the guidance of the rabbis on how to do these specific things, then you're considered from the righteous of the Gentiles, and you have a place in the world to come. There's no question about that. All this other stuff is like dessert, okay?
Right.
And you don't concentrate on dessert. You concentrate on your meal, not your dessert. Okay. So again, these are all philosophical approaches that I have, and people will. Rabbi Weiner will not disagree with me, except in maybe some small things. But he knows the rabbi that I follow, and he has different views, which is fine. But in general, these ideas are the ideas have to understand what it is. That's why I know, as far as this group is concerned specifically, even though in Jewish law I do disagree with them because Moshe Feinstein, who I follow, disagrees with some of the things that they say, we get along fine, and they're all supportive of what I'm trying to do, because what I'm trying to do is transcends any specific legal things that I might say, because it's dealing with the whole approach, the whole worldview that Noahide is supposed to be taking. And that transcends, specific halachic decisions that one rabbi or another would. When I'm talking one rabbi, I'm talking one rabbi who's qualified to make decisions might say. Okay, so, anyways, you'll hear this sermon a lot of times. I guess it comes up often.
So just one last, hopefully quick question. If somebody, if a Noahide is converting, do they have to choose the Ashkenaz or Sephardic way of I don't know, walking?
1 second.
Whatever.
What do you mean converting? Converting to Judaism or leaving?
Yeah, if somebody's converting to Judaism, do they end up actually having to decide whether or not they want to follow the
if you convert to Judaism, you are actually on the level of a newborn baby. Okay? You are free to go anywhere. In fact, people that I know who have converted, I've always said to listen, on the process, when you convert, go around to different Jewish communities before you decide where you're going to go. Don't just go to the community by the person you were converted by, but get to know different communities. See where you feel more comfortable. Okay? You actually have an opportunity to do something that most born Jews do not have, and that is to choose where you feel most comfortable. Okay?
Cool.
Jews who are born in certain places don't really have the opportunity to change outward, because essentially, I'll tell you a secret that most people don't know, even in Judaism. To Hashem, it doesn't make a difference if you follow the custom of the Sephardim or you follow the custom of the Jews of Ashkenaz or Hasidim or this. It doesn't. What's important is that you follow the Jewish system that has come down to you by tradition. That's what's important. Whether you do something another, there's a very famous story. I tell this all the time, but it might be interesting to relate it here. The Baal Shem Tov had a grandson who wrote a work called Degel Machne Ephraim. He was a Rebbe of his own. And around Passover time, he traveled around in the Ukraine, in Russia, to different cities. And he came back to his home after Passover, and he was talking with his Hasidim. This story is related by the Siyatan Rebbe, who was the son, either son or the grandson of the Rizhiner. The Rizhiner was the great-grandson of the Maggid of Mezrich, who I don't remember who he heard it from. So the day of Machnapam came back, and he talked about he went to different places, and he saw Jews in different areas of Ukraine and Russia having different customs that he very much liked. They were very nice. And Hasidim asked him, well, one of the customs that he said that there's one custom I saw a lot of not. There's one custom I saw that I really, really liked. I thought it was very nice. And they asked him what it was. He said that before Passover, there were people, they had a custom that they would take a barrel and fill it up with water that made sure that no leavening, no chametz was in it. And then they covered it up. And over Passover, they only drank from the water from there so they'd be sure that 100% there was no chametz that got into the water. 100%. So the Hasidim asked him, so if you like it so much, why don't you do it yourself? So he said, I don't do it because I didn't see it by my grandfather, the Baal Shem Tov, that he did that. It's very important to understand that in Hashem's eyes, it's more important why you're doing something than exactly what you're doing. And as long as the why is the correct, then what you're doing is going to be good in Hashem's eyes. So if you grow up Sephardic and your custom was to eat rice on Passover, and you eat rice on Passover because custom of people in Sephardim, then that's fine. And if you grew up like me in the Ashkenazim that we don't eat rice on Passover because it was our custom based on, you can go back into this form where the rice is considered to be like something that you can make bread from. It's a very complicated. I'm not going to get into that whole thing. It's not really appropriate to begin with. And if you don't eat it because Ashkenazim, that's also right. Because you're doing because that was what your tradition was. Okay? And in Hashem's eyes, it's fine. As long as you're following the system correctly, it's not the what, it's the why. And that's the concept I know by Christians is very difficult to understand. Because, of course, Christians, when you baptize yourself, if you do it 2 times and not 3 times, then you're going to hell because you didn't baptize yourself enough times. Or if you don't say this way or that way, that's it, forget it, you lost forever, or this, all kinds of weird things like that, which Jews don't understand because we understand it's the why, not exactly the what. The different customs is this. It's okay. That's just what your custom is. So that's why you're doing it, because your custom. It's not, it's not the what. It's the why you're doing it. That's most important. The why is because Hashem commanded the Jewish people on Sinai to follow the Torah and to follow the rabbinic authorities. We did in the first lesson, and that's what you're required to do. And the rabbinic authority ended up that we had customs based on the place and you're supposed to follow because that's what Hashem wants you to do. It really is as simple as that. So when you convert, of course, when a person converts, you don't have any customs. You don't have anything. So essentially, you're at the point of saying, okay, I'm going to make a decision. What do I like better? Okay? And you might find this community, that community. Some communities are less friendly towards things. Getting into a Hasidic community is very, very difficult, except for Lubavitch. But non-Lubavitch because of very, very closed communities. It's very hard to break into it, not just the language, but because you have to really be into it. Okay, it's very difficult. Even Bala Tshuva getting into non-Lubavitch Hasidic groups is very difficult. It's easier because, of course, at least you have some Jewish background, so you have some kind of association. But again, in general, it's very difficult. So again, if someone converts, that's what is conversion. But again, we're talking Noahides here. And when I talk Noahides, we're talking about people for some reason or other they don't want to convert. I mean, they just can't give up that pepperoni pizza or that Big Mac with cheese. They gotta have their bacon and eggs every Sunday morning. If they don't have it, they're just not going to be able to make it through the week. Okay, fine. God doesn't think less of you for that. You were placed where you were placed because those are the trials. Those are the tests you can have in life. And if that's something that you want, that's fine. Judaism is a religion unique in that it recognizes that since Hashem is the God of the whole world, that everybody in the whole world has the opportunity to be considered righteous and be rewarded by Hashem. And you don't have to look like me. Okay? That is the unique thing with Judaism.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, that's the end of my sermon on that subject for now. But these issues will, of course, come up again and again in Zoom sessions, stuff like that. And so if I repeat it, I repeat it. That's all. But it's important to understand some of these underlying issues that are very important. It's what makes Judaism important. It what makes the Noahide path not a, afterthought, but something that to be seriously considered by people who just conversion is just not an option. Okay? It's why the concept of Judaism light is so abhorrent to me, because that's just not what's important. If you want to be non-Jewish and you want to have your pepperoni pizza, that's fine. Just don't wear tefillin and eat pepperoni pizza at the same time. It just doesn't work together. Okay, if you're going to do it, you should be what you are. If you're not going to be, if you want to convert and you think you can do it, that's fine. I don't counsel conversion because I know how difficult it really is. You have to really be dedicated. It's like the old thing about joining the Marines. We want a few good men. If you want to be it, you've got to be somebody who wants to be like a Navy SEAL or, an Army Ranger or somebody who really is willing, to deal with the actual real difficulties of leaving a life which is totally alien to the new life that you want to take on. And it's not easy. Okay. So I'm not encouraging it. Yes. If you're going to ask me, is it spiritually better to convert to Judaism than to be a Noahide? Yes, of course. No question about that. But as Moshe Feinstein wrote in one of his commentaries and in one of his responses, and I've seen it in many other places, it's better to be a Noahide who's keeping the commandments, Noahide commandments properly, than it is to be a Jew who doesn't live Jewish life properly. Many people have converted and have left Judaism also. It's not an unusual thing to happen. There's enough that have done it that it becomes something that you have to always remind people that is something that can happen. And once you convert, there's no going back. So while that ham sandwich you're eating now as a Noahide is not a sin, if you converted, the ham sandwich that you would eat after that, if you went back, would be. So you have to very seriously consider what it is you're giving up. And, it is a thing. I do know somebody who actually was a convert who went back. One of the few converts you see among Hasidic Jews, but he went back. He couldn't take it. There's a lot of things, and I know other converts who are, people that I have a great deal of respect for because they have, acclimated to Jewish life. Okay. It's either way. Again, the bottom line is, Sefer Chassidim says clearly that we're supposed to give more respect to a Noahide who keeps the commandments than a Jew who doesn't. And the Sefer Chassidim is not one of the most liberal works that you can read in Jewish discussion. He was from Hasidic Ashkenaz, who we mentioned before, and his stuff is very, very, very conservative and very restrictive. And if he says that, you can take it to the bank, as they say, that's what Judaism is. Okay, from the most far out on the side, that's what there's a Noahide who keeps the 7 commandments faithfully because Hashem wants said to, is better than a Jew who's not keeping what he's supposed to be doing. Okay, so that's my thing on conversion. Okay, so let's go. We're going into the 19th century. I do want to finish. Looks like we're going to go over a little bit longer, but this particular session always goes long. It always goes long because there's much more questions and much more things coming on. So let's go back to history. 19th century history is a lot of things going on, both in Ashkenaz. Again, Ashkenaz, we're talking means Europe, basically. Although it means Germany, it means Europe. And the center of Jewish life now in Europe is in Poland. And, so you have to understand that. And in the Sephardic world, a lot of stuff is going on. So let's go in Ashkenaz, what's going on. First, we mentioned the Enlightenment. In 1820s, the Reform movement is founded in Germany. That is one of the greatest disasters for the Jewish people in the last 1,000 years before. The greatest disaster. What happened is within a few generations, German Judaism was decimated. Conversion was great. Assimilation was great. It was almost a total elimination of German Jewry. Okay, people don't talk about it very much, but that's really what happened. German Jewry was virtually wiped out. And by the way, the more assimilated the Jews became, the more anti-Semitic the Germans came. Okay, anti-Semitism was the real kind of anti-Semitism we see that culminated in the Second World War, comes from Germany, from Jews wanting to become Germans, converting to Christianity. There was a similar, but not so much in Spain. With the conversos, the Moranos, they were also treated the same way. In Germany, it was basically the same way, except here they just gave up, and conversion was rampant. And conversion essentially was a way to get accepted into German society. You couldn't go to university if you weren't Christian, and since the Reform valued that university education and learning and stuff like that, part of the Enlightenment, people converted to Christianity right and left. And German Jewry was decimated. Where cities like Frankfurt were big Jewish centers of learning, having great rabbis being there, Germany was virtually wiped out. All those centers that we talked about in the Middle Ages, which are centers of Jewish learning, were gone. Okay, 1823, we have a blood libel in Russia. Russia is becoming worse and worse and worse. Okay, 1881 to 1884 is the first major wave of pogroms in Russia. It's going to be a story from 1880 until into the 20th century, pogroms in Russia. Okay, as I mentioned, the Russians, when they set up the Pale settlements, not because they loved the Jews, because they hated the Jews. That was basically the program. The Russian Tsar wanted the Jews to either convert or leave or die. That's basically what he was interested in. And so in 1881, 1840 comes the first wave of pogroms in Russia. That also leads to the first emigration of Jews from that area to the United States. So you find many Jews who were in America who didn't assimilate, but can trace their ancestors Jews from that time. And even Jews who assimilated, but they came from Jews who came in the late 19th century. Okay. 1882, there was a blood libel in Hungary. Hungary was also an area where the Jews did not fare very well. It was better than most places. That's why the Hungarian Jews were much more assimilated, but it wasn't as good. In 1899, there was a blood libel in Austria-Hungary, Austro-Hungarian Empire. Remember at the time, Austro-Hungarian Empire was one place. In the Sephardic lands, there are a number of important things that we have to know. From 1808 to 1840 is the second Aliyah, the second coming from Jews coming from Eastern Europe to Israel. What distinguishes this from the first one is the first one was only Hasidim. During this period of time, there was Hasidim, and also was coming from the school of the Vilna Gaon who came. They settled, many of them settled in Jerusalem. And to this day, the people who belong to that group, they're called the Perushim. You can see them in Jerusalem. Their dress is very, very similar to the Hasidim. They wear shtreimel on Shabbos because the shtreimel was a garment that was worn at that time in the early 1800s by Jews everywhere in Eastern Europe. And they dress very similar. They wear long garments and everything like that. If you know what to look for, you can tell the difference between them. But if you go to places like Maish Urim and you walk the streets, you see people there, and especially on Shabbos, you're not going to know the difference between who's from the Hasidim and who's not, unless you know what to look for. Okay, so they went there, and also the Hasidim went there. That's when the city from Tveria and Sfas, they were both became very big Hasidic settlements. Tveria, Mendel of Vitebsk, one of the main Talmidim from the main disciples from the Rebbe from Mezrich, Rebbe Dov from Mezrich, who took over after the Baal Shem Tov. He went there. A number of significant Hasidic rabbis settled other places, including Sfas, Bas Ayin. Author Bas Ayin is buried in Sfas. He has a very, very interesting gravesite in the cemetery in Sfas. The author Rabbinic Chaim, a very important comment from one Talmidim from the Baal Shem Tov. Quite a number of people who go there. When you go there, you would see the Hasidic rabbis who are very well known to you, who came from during this Aliyah from 1808 to 1840. Now, in addition to that, what happened is, as I mentioned before, the life of Jews in Islamic lands was not, rainbows and was rainbows and whatever. It wasn't everything. Everything wasn't always good. Okay, 1834 to 1835, there were pogroms in the city of Sfad, Hebron, and Jerusalem. Remember, Hebron was a city that had a Jewish population from the time of the Second Temple until 1929, when there was a major pogrom there, where the Jews ended up having to flee. But until that time, Hebron had a Jewish population back to the Second Temple period of time. Sfad was, of course, where the Hasidim were in Jerusalem, was also a place where Jews lived. You can't say always from the Second Temple period of time, but except for a certain period of time when there was expulsions, the Jews weren't allowed to live there, whether under the Romans, during the Christians, there was a time that they weren't allowed to live there. Basically, there was settlement in Jerusalem almost continued, but Hebron had to continue. 1840 in Damascus, there was a blood libel, and another blood libel in Rhodes in 1840. Now, another major event happening there. Now, we talked about the Aliyahs, Jews coming from Europe to Israel in two groups of Hasidim, and then the followers of the Hasidim together with the followers of the Vilna Gaon. These people went for religious reasons. They wanted to live in the Holy Land, where there's just things different in the Holy Land that you can do that you can't do in other places. It's just different. It's very hard to explain what it is. Maybe if we ever sometime are able to organize that Noahide tour of Israel, we'll discuss about those kinds of issues during some kind of thing like that. It's back in my mind sometime, but that's not tomorrow. So that's what they want to do. However, in the late 1800s, as the reaction for the growing anti-Semitism in places like Germany and like that, and the way life is, they developed what's called the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement was a movement that wanted to go to the land of Israel, settle there, because the Ottoman Empire was very favorable towards such things, because basically that the land of Israel at that time was basically a wasteland. There were cities where people lived. By the end of the 1800s, Jerusalem actually had a Jewish majority. It certainly had a plurality, but I think it had a majority also. But the rest being Christians and Muslims. But the plurality certainly was Jewish, and I believe it was also the majority was Jewish by that time. But these people wanted to come not to settle in the cities like the Hasidim and the Talmidim from the Vilna Gaon did. They wanted to cultivate the land, develop things there, with the eventual goal that there should be a state at some time in the future. This was a movement that was basically rejected by the overwhelming majority of religious Jews at the time. There were some religious Zionists at the time, but they were not very many. So between 1882 and 1903, it's called the first Aliyah of Jews who were Zionists going to Israel. They settled, they bought land, mostly swampland, which was, not usable for anything. They drained it, they made it arable, and they started growing crops. And that was the beginning of the settlement there. There were other places were settled outside the city of Maya Shurim. The area of Maya Shurim was actually settled around this time by, I think Baron Rothschild was the one who gave the money to settle this. So religious Jews started settling there. So there was a group of people coming there. Their ultimate goal was, of course, to have, a state there where basically was barren land. Okay. As it built up, there was a lot of Muslims that came there, Arabs that came there because of it. But essentially, at the time when they went, there was nothing. Mark Twain traveled to Israel, and he describes how basically the cities there were very small populations in the city, and basically most of the land was a wasteland. Which, of course, if you read what it says about the curse of the Jewish people, and the Jewish people get exiled from the land, it basically becomes a wasteland. Okay, so those are the historical events that occurred during the 19th century. And so now we're going to deal with the main rabbis in Europe and in Sfard. Okay. I'll take a break for a couple of minutes. Are there any questions that someone might have on what we said? Dan, you can take a look in Facebook or YouTube. Anybody ask a question? Is there any question of interest on what we did until now? And then we're going to get quick step. Okay. 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 Then what I will say is, for those of people who are watching, listening, whatever, we do have a Zoom session here, actually a real Zoom session here, where a lot of times, either before or afterwards, I interact with people who are here. When we talk together, we talk about different things. So it's a little bit more of an advantage if you can come to the Zoom session. Of course, you can feel more of an interaction because you're actually talking to me directly. I see you talking to me directly. So there is certainly that advantage. And of course, if you can't, then of course, YouTube and Facebook is of course good. And this is of course the third session. There's other sessions, so you might want to come and visit on the other sessions. Each session, of course, is different because people ask different questions and we go off on different tangents in different sessions. So, so far as I know, the third session we have now is usually the best one because then we get the most people and most questions, most interesting things go on. But still, the interaction for me is what's very important. I'm glad that many of you can listen, but the Zoom sessions are here because of the personal type of interaction that you can have with me and I can have with you, which for Noahide, I believe, is one of the purposes of Noahide Path. One of the purposes of what I'm doing is to get that personal interaction. Okay, so let's now continue. We'll go through the rabbis here. We're going to get to some rabbis who are extremely important nowadays, the people who you're going to be hearing about when people talk about Jewish law as it applies to Noahide. So let's go through some of them. Okay, the first one I want to talk about in the city in Galicia, which is was at that time under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The person's name is Yosef Babad. He was a very important person as far as Jewish law is concerned. He was a very important rabbi. He wrote a work called Minchas Chinuch. Minchas Chinuch is a commentary on the work Sefer Chinuch. We mentioned that before when we were talking about Spain during the Middle Ages. It was a work written by some people, Arna Levi in Barcelona. And the work is basically on each one of the mitzvahs. He talks about the mitzvahs. And towards the end of it, he talks about who it applies to. So sometimes mitzvahs apply only to men. Sometimes mitzvahs only apply to the priests. Sometimes it applies to men and women, but they're only if they're living in the land of Israel. Sometimes it refers to every Jew, no matter where they live. So he talks about it in that way. Now, the Minchas Chinuch is a commentary on it. So he talks about all the parts, what's there. He'll bring what the Rambam says, comparing it because the Minchas Chinuch is basically interacting with the Rambam. And he'll bring very many halachic issues, what applies, what it is. Very interesting as far as things are concerned. And uniquely and importantly for Noahides, he also will at times bring whether a specific thing applies to a Noahide. So, for example, the Minchas Chinuch says that this applies to take the first mitzvah, which is mitzvah of being fruitful and multiply. So the Minchas Chinuch will say this applies to Jewish men. Okay, it doesn't apply to a woman, it applies to Jewish men. There's all reasons for them when we get into it. So the Minchas Chinuch discusses, does this apply to Bnei Noach? Okay, now he brings from Sanhedrin, Sanhedrin, other places, where we see clearly that no, it does not apply to Noahides. So Noahides are not commanded to be fruitful and multiply. They're not commanded that they have to have children. Okay, there's of course reasons why women Noahides should get married, keep you from sinning and stuff like that, and doing things that aren't forbidden by the Noahide law. That's a different issue. But as far as the mitzvah of this mitzvah, it does not apply. Okay, so that's why the Minchas is very important. There were many, many times where he discusses mitzvahs there, and he mentions as to whether it applies to Noahides or doesn't. Now, if you are going to, for example, if the discussion goes up, for example, are Noahides required in the mitzvah of being fruitful, multiplied? If you're listening to a rabbi and he doesn't mention the Minchas Chinuch, then this rabbi has not delved into the subject sufficiently that you can consider him an authority on the subject. So that's as simple as that. Okay, again, we're dealing with Noahides and rabbis, and I'm trying to give you hints and ideas. And when you're dealing with somebody, is this rabbi somebody who knows the subject sufficiently that you can rely upon him as somebody to tell you what to do? Or is he somebody who doesn't know so much, but maybe some of the other stuff he's doing is fine? Okay, so Minhag Chinuch is one of those works that are significant for the rabbis you're interacting with to have learned. It is not a simple work. He brings sources and assumes the person who's reading him is on a certain level of learning of Torah. I mentioned it many times before that boys go to yeshiva to learn until they're 18 or so when they get married, whatever. But the main reason why they're learning, the main thing they're doing when they're learning in yeshiva is they're learning how they should be able to learn later on when they get older, so that they will know, how they should pick up a work like the Minhag Chinuch and be able to go through it and understand what he's trying to say. That's what yeshiva is for. Learning, what you do afterwards is building on what you learned in yeshiva, but basically you should be learning, just to give you the tools in order to be able to learn. Okay. The next person I want to talk about is Avram Hirsch Eisenstadt. He wrote a work called Pischei Tshuva. Now, I mentioned to you before, he's from the city of Bialystok, which was in Russian Poland. Now I believe it's in Belarus, but it's considered being Polish, but it's really in Belarus now. He wrote a work called Pischei Tshuva. Now, we mentioned before the word Vayhaitiv, which is taking the commentaries on Shulchan Aruch and bringing like the final rulings on that in one place. Pischei Tshuva brings responsive works from later times or periods like that, where the person either agrees or disagrees or brings other things that are related to what the Vayhaitiv says. So many times it's sort of, look and see what the Vayhaitiv says, and this responsive work says this responsive work says this, responsive work says that. Either adding to it, some things are not added there, or sometimes even being under other views. Again, this is a work as far as the just brought so that you should understand the tradition of Jewish learning that rabbis go through. Okay, the next person is actually a Hasidic rabbi, Yehuda Aryeh Leib Alter. He wrote a work called Sfas Emes. He was the Rebbe in Ger. Ger today is if not the biggest, the second biggest Hasidic group in the world. I mentioned him not because of that. What we're going to do later on, as I mentioned, a whole Zoom session on Hasidim, and we'll do a whole Zoom session on Yeshiva world. But he's important because he wrote a Talmud commentary called Sfas Emes, surprisingly, and that is very much taken up and accepted in the Jewish world, both the Chassidim and non-Chassidim. He also wrote, there's written down from him teachings on the weekly portion and on the Jewish holidays. That's very popular, not just among Chassidim but from his group, but also in the Yeshivish world. His is one of the works that are learned. We're going to talk about Ger, where it comes from, and some of the principles behind Ger that differentiates from other groups. But you should know that he was a Talmudic scholar and very important also. The next person is someone I'm sure most of you heard of, Yisrael Kagan. He wrote the work called Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah is a commentary on the first section of Shulchan Aruch called Orach Chaim, which is the daily things. He came out of the school of Vilna Gaon, so many of his rulings are actually based on the views that the Vilna Gaon took. So it's not necessarily the views that other people would have. However, in the yeshiva world today, the Mishnah Berurah is basically the go-to place as far as how to act, as far as the laws for that's concerned. He's very interesting. He actually did not get smicha until he had to travel out of Poland, and then Chaim Ozer gave him a ksav smicha so he could use the name Rabbi on his passport so he can get out. Very interesting. I actually know somebody who's probably going to the Yeshiva Radom. Next person in that area in Lithuania is Chaim Soloveitchik. He's important. He's the founder of the Brisk Yeshiva. Brisk Yeshiva is a very important yeshiva in the yeshiva movement. There's a Brisk Yeshiva now in Jerusalem, which is led by his great grandson, whatever. He wrote Chadisha Rabbinic Chaim. which is a way of learning Talmud, which was unique, well, according to him, the way he learned, which is different from the way other people learn. And we're going to talk about next time different ways of learning, and we'll see that his method was quite unique. Okay, next we'll deal with the area of Russia and Ukraine. The three people I'm going to bring here is basically people who, again, come out of the students of the Vilna Gaon. But these are important people because they lead to things that are important later on. First, in the city of Volozhin, which is where the yeshiva from Volozhin started, which is the father of all the yeshiva system, was Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. He's called a Nitzav. I believe that's his response called Nitzav, or his novella on the Talmud is called Nitzav. And he also wrote on the Torah, Emek Dover is a commentary. And from his Talmidim spread out a number of different yeshivas, making up the yeshiva system. And again, we're going to go through the yeshiva system and how people come from different things like that, so you understand these relationships. The next person is Yechiel Mechel Epstein. He wrote an important halachic work called Aruch HaShulchan. It is a Shulchan Aruch on all four portions of the Shulchan Aruch. He basically goes through it and discusses each of the halachas in a little bit more of a depth. This was very much accepted, somewhat in competition to the Mishnah Berurah, but it was highly accepted by those people who came from the schools of the Vilna Gaon. By the Hasidim, not. The final person in Russia, Ukraine, that I'm going to talk about is Baruch Epstein. He's also very important for the Yeshiva movement. He was in Pinsk, and he wrote a work called Torah Tamima. It's a commentary on the Torah, but he brings, in his explanation, he brings in different passages from the Talmud that are related to it. It's a very interesting type of commentary, very popular in the Yeshiva world. After that, we'll do in Lithuania and Latvia. There are two people I'm going to mention here. The first one is Maya Simcha from Dvinsk. Dvinsk now is in Poland, but at the time it was, I think, in Latvia, Lithuania. I'm not sure which one it was. His major work is called Ar Sameach, Talmudic commentary, if I remember correctly. But most importantly, as far as Noahide is concerned, is a very interesting work called Chemdas Yisrael. It's a collection of a lot of different things, very deeply and difficult to understand, written at a high level of Talmudic learning. But what he does have is he has a section discussing the Rambam's laws dealing with Noahides. And he goes into them very much in depth. It's a very difficult thing to learn, but it's also key to learn if you're going to be involved in teaching Noahide. So, for example, one of the things he has there, which is very interesting, is that he has a discussion of why does the Rambam say that it's either 7 or 6:13 and nothing in between. He goes into a very deep discussion of that issue. We'll talk maybe a little bit more about that. We talk about original Noahides, and he explains it. It's quite difficult what he explains, but he brings a lot of sources, and he brings the arguments where it comes about based on verses in the Torah. So again, this is a work that is fundamental. If you hear a rabbi talk about that, then you know that this person has actually taken the time to try and find the sources that are necessary for him to understand in order to understand it. The last person in Lithuania from that time that I want to bring is Moshe Mordechai Epstein. He wrote a work called Levish Mordechai. He was from Slobodka. Slobodka is a very important yeshiva, and I mention it only because that's going to be one of the yeshivas that we talk about. In Germany, Shimshon Fal Hirsch is important. A lot of people who are Noahides look at the Hirsch Chimish because it's a very nice commentary. It's one that's 100% good for Noahides. He won't have anything in there that gets into questionable stuff for Noahides, Kabbalistic stuff or stuff that requires a certain background that a Noahide might not have. And if you don't have the background, you can come to have wrong ideas. Rabbi Hirsch, Shimshon Fal Hirsch, his whole purpose in life was to try and counter the reform movement in Germany, which was basically decimating German Jewry with assimilation and with conversion to Christianity. Now, after the war, his community resettled in Washington Heights. It's a very small community. It's not a community that's been growing, and the reason is because the conditions on which what he was dealing with, the conditions in Germany, did not exist after World War II. So while you have seen people who continued there because they were from German Jewry, in general, these people who came from German Jewry are basically, their children and grandchildren become absorbed into the yeshiva movement. Some became Hasidim. I know somebody who came from Washington Heights. He became Mojitz at Fusid. We'll hear about Mojitz later when we talk about Hasidim, because it is a significant group in Israel. And one of my trips to Israel, I actually met with the Moshe Rebbe. Very, very nice. Okay. Hungary, Romania, and Czechoslovakia, we're going to deal with them all together. There's basically two people of importance there. The one that's most important and a significant name you should remember is Moshe Sofer. He wrote the word Chassam Sofer, which is on the Talmud, on Jewish law, and he even wrote on the weekly parshas, which is something that's very, very popular. You might refer to him as really the father of Hungarian Judaism, because all of the major rabbis from the non-Hasidic world, all the major rabbis in the non-Hasidic world basically came from his students. Okay? And basically his students. So you find all the major rabbis after were really followers of him. The next person is the Malbim. He was a rabbi in Bucharest. He wrote an important commentary on the Bible called the Malbim. I don't think it's in English. If it was, it would be great. It's a very nice commentary, and it's one that I think is very important for Noahides to learn. So let's go into the Sephardic lands. Sephardic there at that time is the most important was Yosef Chaim from the city of Baghdad. He wrote a work, Ben Ish Chai. Some of you may have heard. He is probably one of the most significant rabbis in the Sephardic world. He wrote on Jewish law. He wrote Bible commentaries, Torah, and he also was a very big Kabbalist from the school of the Dashash, as I mentioned before. In his response are actually written in two parts. One part deals with Jewish law in general, and the second part, he has people who ask him questions about Kabbalah, so he included his answers in his volumes on his response. Okay, and that ends the 18th century. We're holding on to the 19th century. I will entertain questions. Dan? Dan, you told me you have to write it down. Is it possible that Ronald can take over for you, or is that not possible? Okay. So what you can, if you can, to the broadcast, why don't you put again the Zoom session where you can find it? Okay. Okay, fine. So as long as the Zoom session is by the Facebook and there, then those people who are on Facebook or in the Zoom in YouTube, you can come over here. I'm sorry it just took that long, but a lot of good questions and discussions do come up. This is one of the problems with this particular time period, that we do get a lot of questions and discussion issues that come up. Some of our best things come up in this time. So if you want to come over to here to Zoom session, you are more than welcome. You know what? I noticed I did not start the recording here. So let me start the recording for the last part here.
Recording in progress.
Okay, so I don't lose that, because you're going to have the recording from there, and I'll have to take the recording from here. Okay, for those who listen to the recording, you are going to have to listen to from Dan on the first part here, because I forgot to start it. This is probably the last 10, 20 minutes, the last part of it, unfortunately, which is very sad, because a lot of important things we said until now. So I'm going to have to figure out what to do with that. Anyways, those people who are listening on YouTube or in Facebook, if you can come to Zoom, please come here. It's very, very good if you can. More the merrier, Ronald. Anybody who comes in, you should, of course, let him in as quick as possible, because when Dan has to stop it, he'll have to stop it. And that's all there is to it. And we do want to go into the 20th century. The 20th century is very important in sense that it will introduce you to people who are things and events and people who are extremely important for today, what's going on. So if you can come over to Zoom, that is very highly recommended. Okay, Dan, is there any question? If not, then I'm going to try and start here. And when you have to go, you got to go. Any questions out there? Okay, so anyways, those people who are there, all I can tell you is I wish you could come over to Zoom. If it's any way possible that you can do it, please come over. I don't know how long we're going to be taking on this, because we'll probably take questions at the end, but we're going to deal now with the 20th century. And this is important because we're still in Europe and we're still in certain places, but that's going to change in the 20th century. Okay, so let's start history. Now, I'm not going to be making any distinction between history as far as the Sephardic world and the European world. We're going to straight go to history for both together, because they're becoming more and more intertwined. Okay, 1903 was the famous blood libel in Kishinev, which led to the pogroms in Kishinev in Russia. These I remember today as probably from the worst pogroms that occurred in Russia. 1903, 1906, after the Kishinev, there was a series, which was actually the second wave of pogroms in Russia, that led to many Jews fleeing from Russia and coming to America. So you will find many Jews who came before the Second World War. Their ancestors, or they themselves, or their parents, came to America during this period of time, essentially fleeing from the pogroms that were going on at that time. Okay. We have in 1910, there was a blood libel in Iran, of all places. The blood libels were not very common in the Islamic world. The blood libels was specifically a Christian thing, but that changed in the 20th century. 1913 is the last known European blood libel trial, the famous Beilis trial in Russia. He was acquitted, Mendel Beilis, but it was something that happened there. Okay, after that we have the World War I, 1940 to 1919. There are a number of important things that you have to know about this. Number one is the Jewish population in Eastern Europe went through a period of disruption, because the war there was Germany, Austria were fighting against Russia until 1917, when Russia left. And what was happening is the wars were fought over areas where the Jewish communities were. Jews lived primarily in that time in small towns, although there had been movement to the big cities, but there were still Jews who lived in small towns. And during this time, the wars would go through these towns and people would flee. So in this time, many rabbis and many people fled to big cities like Vienna, Prague, Lemberg, which is the city of Lvov in Ukraine. They fled to all these places in order to have sanctuary against being that these cities would be safer than living in the countryside where the war was going over. And the effect that had was on the younger generation, because you would have, the yeshiva system, kids learning would be interrupted, and this affected their abilities to keep Judaism, to keep the laws of Judaism, and it affected many people. So after the World War ended, one of the things that were going on is many rabbis, many yeshivas were trying to rebuild on the destruction that happened from the First World War. The Jewish community is there, and of course it was totally, the Second World War ended that, but for the war years, between the war years, was a time of attempting to rebuild Judaism as it had been before World War I. In fact, Jews consider that World War II is actually just a continuation of World War I, because things never settled down there, and actually the problem started from World War I. Okay. 1920, with the fall of the
Hey, folks, sorry about this, but I've got to step out and shut down the broadcast. But I encourage everybody to jump into the Zoom room. I've added the link in the chat on YouTube, and the link is in on Facebook. And so my friend Ronald will let you into the Zoom room if you want to continue hearing the message. Excellent session for sure. So until next time, have a wonderful, wonderful day, everybody. Bye for now.